Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined the second day of the 2021 Biotech Atelier. My name is Valentin Nikolov, and it is with great pleasure that I give the start of today's session on advanced healthcare technologies from concept to practice. First of all, I would like to thank all panelists and keynote speakers, as well as the organizers for making the event possible. I wish all attendees an exciting day of inspiring discussions, and I hope you will join us again at the upcoming satellite events, and of course again in September 2022. Now let us start with our first panel, which we have named HIV, the Neglected Pandemic. We're joined by a wonderful panel of speakers who will share their views on the ongoing efforts to send this disease into history. We will discuss the main challenges and achievements, and I hope we will inspire more people from the audience to participate actively in the fight against HIV. Our panelists are Professor Radka Argirova, Docent Ivaylo Alexiev, Ms. Susan Cole, Dr. Tamas Bereszky, and Mr. Momchil Baev. I urge panelists to adhere as much as possible to the recommended timeline of 10 minutes so that we have more time for discussion. In the meantime, all attendees are welcome to submit their questions in the chat, of which we'll try to address as many as possible. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Radka Argirova. Professor Argirova specialized medical virology in the Ivanovsky Virology Institute of Moscow, and has ever since dedicated her life and her scientific career to the study of viruses. She led the Central Laboratory on HIV in Bulgaria from its very establishment and introduced the strain of the HIV virus in Bulgaria for the first time, enabling early research on the pathogen in the country. Throughout her career, Professor Argirova has participated in numerous national and international committees and working groups involved in virology and retroviral research and activism. She had a pivotal role in raising the awareness and downscaling the fear and stigma regarding HIV and AIDS in Bulgaria, which she continues to perform to this day. Professor Argirova is currently heading the medical virology laboratory at the Acibadem Tokuda hospital. Today, she will share her perspective on the achievements and challenges that the HIV pandemic has faced and is still facing. Professor Argirova, welcome. We see the shared presentations. Now, if you can make it full screen, you can start. And also, I would like to mention that we don't see you on the camera. And maybe there is a switch up there to switch the camera on, or there is a sticker placed on it. So if possible, switch it on so that we can see your face also. Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Maybe the video will not work, but I can hear you quite well. So I think if the camera won't start, you can share the slides and we can go on with the slides.
Share. Ja, така. Камерата трябва да е включена. Ето. Аха.
Great.
Let's
Great.
go, huh?
We see you. Yes.
Yes.
Please share the slides once more so that we can see them.
Продължавай с слайдовете. Share.
And please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Valentin. Thank you for this introduction, for the nice words you have just said. First of all, I would like also to express my gratitude to all the organizers and to sponsors of this Biotech Atelier. I think it's fourth, which is made in Bulgaria. And it's important because just this year, we, all of us, mark the 40 years of the description of first AIDS case. So that's why it's worth mentioning the greatest and the biggest challenges and achievements in the science and research which changed the face of the whole pandemic. Just a moment. The next one. I would say why neglected? Maybe just today neglected because it develops on the background of COVID-19 pandemics, but nevertheless, this pandemic has since its beginning been a fast evolving field and object of interest for all medical researchers, and later on not only for medical, but also for all kinds of scientists. To say briefly, evidence from the past 40 years indicates that the scientific innovation, research, funding, activism, policies are all central components of fighting success and also messaging the pandemics to the public. But nevertheless, many things and a lot of science has been invested into this problem, but there are things which remain on place and which we should find further. And this is the first of all, if health equity focused approaches, which are not developed enough. They are necessary, according to me, in next years to close all the gaps in the HIV epidemic. Next. And this seems the most important. Here I would like only to listen to mention the main achievements during these 40 years. But my question is, have all of us real health equity, access to testing, to treatment, to information? The main achievement is that HIV is not anymore a fatal diagnosis. Thanks to introducing antiretroviral therapy, a once fatal diagnosis turned into a chronic condition requiring monitoring and discontinuous lifelong treatment. Globally, after 1984, thanks to ART, a serious reduction of mother-to-child transmission was achieved. One tablet regimens were introduced instead of 10, 15, 20 tablets. Also, these achievements inspire hope for good quality of life, not only for the HIV-infected people and the people living with HIV and AIDS, but also for their relatives, for the whole society. And that's why it became very clear that it's not a job only for medical science and pharmacology, but also it engaged the whole society. Soon it became clear in 28 that the HIV infection can be cured. And you know all about the first Berlin patient, later the London patient. And this raised the hope and enforced the research for new medicines, especially those stimulating the exit, the going out of integrated proviral DNA in some cells of immune system. Today we have already PrEP and PEP, these very important tools for prevention, and we have the strategy treatment as prevention, which works very well. We have a new UNAIDS program, new aims into this program. The earlier was 90, 90, 90, now it comes to 95, 95, 95, and all of you know how important it is. At last, it is not, of course, all, but the main achievements is that the patients on antiretroviral therapy today has the same life expectancy as a person without HIV. This should be communicated not only to the patients, to our patients, they know it, but also to the whole society. The next slide. The next slide, please. Yes. Here I would like to mention something very important. This is about the formula undetectable means untransmittable, which becomes a very, very serious basis for productive lives of HIV-infected people. You know that in Switzerland in 2028, for the first time was proved and announced that with a letter that if undetectable viral load was maintained longer than 6 months, no viral transmission to uninfected partner is realized. This is the basis of this formula I have just mentioned. And there was a great campaign, it is currently also going, to increase awareness about the social, sexual, and reproductive health options for people living with HIV and their sexual partners, to eliminate HIV stigma, very important, to encourage individuals with HIV to initiate and adhere to ART, and to prompt public discourse to reduce engagement in HIV treatment. This campaign currently goes also in Bulgaria, and in 2018 it was officially adopted and propagated by the Ministry of Health, and we are very happy about it. Today we know that biomedical prevention and treatment can end these terrible epidemics. The next, please. But HIV-related stigma and discrimination remain on place, and we could not close our eyes about it. The next 2 slides I have taken from a very serious report made by Gilead, and here I would like to show you the brief definitions of stigma. Stigma is significantly to discredit an individual in the eyes of others, and discriminations, actions or omissions directed toward an individual as a result of stigma, very serious things. And the next slide shows you, the next please, shows you not full, not exhaustive, but a very serious list of different stigma towards people living with HIV/AIDS. Of course, I shall not read it, but what is interesting in this slide, this is different kinds of stigmas, restrictions in travel, inequality acts, criminalizing of sexual workers, TG people prosecuting, and many others, homosexuality also in different countries. So we see that this is even at the level of the government, and it's a pity that today there are also such stigma laws and legislative acts. The next, please. Here in Bulgaria, what are our main problems in this field? The stigma and discrimination still exists, and in health medical professionals also, not all of course, but in some of them, they are not, let's say, they do not agree to work with these people. This stigma also exists in general population. What do we need in the light of our Bioatelier aims? We need a promotion of health equity, meaning that the health is a human right for everybody. NGOs activists we need to promote solidarity and support for people living with HIV. We need lobbies for increased funding and research on HIV treatment. We need challenge messaging that stigmatized and promoted harmful myths about HIV transmission and prompted partnerships with advocacy organizations and social justice movement. We have a lot of them, but nevertheless, we need still some scientific and research achievements, and as a virologist, I have listed some of them, which are waiting with great interest. For example, the science for monitoring of latent reservoirs of the virus, medicines entering the latent reservoirs to purge the integrated virus to blood where the ARC treatment could be applied successfully, of course. Monoclonal antibodies and neutralizing and non-neutralizing antibodies. Vaccines. We know that the so far developed ones demonstrate about 40% efficacy only, and this is not convenient for the pharma industry to fabricate them. We wait about the gene therapy, which will be the therapy of future, I'm sure about it, but we still need many experiments about it. The next, please. And now I said just in the beginning that under the conditions of this COVID-19 pandemics, SARS-CoV-2 sharpened social and health inequity, where HIV-related stigma is strong. Here, very serious, appropriate information is needed. WHO reports, based on research, say that HIV infection is an independent risk factor for severe course of COVID-19. People living with HIV should have prioritized access to COVID-19 vaccines. And I am very proud that here in Sofia, for example, from our own experience, we have 40 people vaccinated voluntarily, of course, with anti-COVID vaccines, and we have even tested them for antibodies, and they have only 1 out of these 40 people could not develop neutralizing antibodies. All the others have developed it. And at the moment of immunization, they had all of them undetectable viral load. Nobody had interrupted ART, and the CD4 number was never under 350 per microliter. The next, please. What I have mentioned just in the beginning, we are living today into with two pandemics, the HIV and COVID-19, both caused by RNA-containing viruses. But we have a very interesting situation now, and questions arise. For HIV, we have treatment, but no vaccine. For COVID-19, we have vaccines, but no etiological treatment. We know very well where is the reason. It is in the proviral DNA of HIV, which hides into some of the cells of the immune system, and not only, of course, and which are a source for further virus development. This is the object of next research, which I have just a little bit mentioned. The only HIV-related factor associated with mortality in COVID-19 is the low number of CD4 cells. The discussion about antiretrovirals and their success to cure COVID-19 showed no anti-COVID-19 activity. Introducing of quarantines, social distancing, and public health measures to reduce COVID-19 created a lot of inconvenience: access to routine HIV testing, access to routine medical examinations, even access to treatment during the lockdowns, you know. A part of medical personnel has been transferred to COVID-19 clinics or wards, which created difficulties for people living with HIV. And the next. So we see something similar between HIV epidemics and COVID-19 epidemics, I mean in the sense of stigma, in the sense of miss of information, in the sense of health promotion, in the sense of access to vaccines or therapy and monitoring. Of course, the conclusion is that today we need a full restoration of healthcare systems, which are challenged by COVID-19, to restore them in their full capacity, and to go further with the public and health response to HIV/AIDS, which will help also to go further with the fight against the COVID-19 pandemics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Argirova. I am very glad that you touched a lot of different aspects of this pandemic, including a lot of the problems that patients with HIV are facing. And I am also glad that for the panel we were able to invite and be joined by actual patient activists who will later on share their stories and their experience combating this disease. But first, I would like to introduce Associate Professor Ivaylo Alexiev, who will be the second speaker. Docent Alexiev is head of the National Reference Confirmation Laboratory for HIV at the Center for Infectious and Parasitic Diseases in Bulgaria. After he graduated cell biology and development at the Sofia University, He started his scientific research in the field of blood-borne infections and HLA typing for stem cell transplantation. He has been head of the NRCL of HIV since 2016, where his main areas of focus are HIV drug resistance and molecular epidemiology. Docent Alexiev has also successfully introduced next-generation sequencing technology in his laboratory, which is currently used to advance viral genomic studies of both HIV and the newly emerged SARS-2 virus. Docent Alexiev will talk about how we are addressing the virus's resistance to antiretroviral drugs in our efforts to achieve viral suppression. Docent Alexiev, I'm very happy that you are here. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nikolov. I was not aware of the purpose of this meeting in the beginning, and now I see that this will be a very nice discussion among friends and colleagues, and hope we'll have a good time to share. So I'm really happy to join this meeting.
Sorry.
Thank you again. And I will put my...
Somebody was wanted to say something before we continue with Docent Alexiev. Who was it? Excuse me? Okay, maybe I heard wrong. So, sorry for this interruption, Docent Alexiev. You can continue.
I have just a few slides. It's mainly about resistance, because the resistance is one of the biggest obstacles to treat patients, and also now we have this hope and a new agenda to try to eradicate HIV. So the resistance is really important for the patients and really important for the future management of this disease. This year, as Professor Argirova said, it is 40 years after the first discovery of the disease. AIDS was first reported in June 1985 for few patients. Then very soon it was reported in July, and in December was the first publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, where the disease and the patients were described. Many years after that, it's not like in the COVID era, where we have vaccine very soon, after the less than a year after the first official report. But here with AIDS, we have not developed vaccine because of the specific retrovirus, but the drug was used and applied for treatment for AIDS, and the first drug was AZT. It was introduced in 1987. It was almost 5-6 years after the first discovery of the new disease, AIDS. This was a very nice achievement. However, there were some problems that came with the treatment. Of course, this was toxicity from the new drug, resistance, and the problem that came with good adherence, because the drug was specific and adherence was very important for this treatment. After the introduction of monotherapy, it was very soon found that resistance appeared very soon, and with the development of the second class of drugs, it was found that dual or triple therapy was very much in favor of reducing resistance problems. So after the introduction of triple therapy in 1995, from 1996, it was already standard, and we call this treatment highly active antiretroviral treatment. In these graphs, we can see that there are some issues related to resistance and optimal adherence. We know that there are quite a big number of viral particles that are generated in the body. So there are about 10 of 10 number of viral particles, and the rate of mutation is pretty high for this virus, for HIV, very high. The chance of evolving resistance mutation is really significant. In this way, triple therapy using 3 different classes of antiretroviral drugs helped a lot to curb with the disease. We have studies that indicated that when we use less than 3 drugs, the chance of having resistance increase. Now, in the modern era, we have more and more different classes of antiretroviral drugs, which targets different kinds of replication cycle of the virus. And starting from 1988, when the AZT was introduced, and now in the modern era, we have very different options, and a lot of options. We have combinations of different class drugs in one pill, so it is easy to be to apply the medicine from the individuals with HIV, and this helps better adhere to therapy. However, resistance can appear, and this is how important is the monitoring of treatment. Virological monitoring can give us knowledge about how the treatment works. If the treatment works fine, the CD4 cells, which are the main target of the virus, low, and the viral load is high. And so with this virological monitoring, we can check for resistance mutations who can make the drug not work so properly, or even it's 100% resistant. And then the laboratory that performs this kind of test can advise the clinicians to change therapy with drugs that would be susceptible for this individual patient. It's very important to monitor the patients even before starting the therapy, which could give us information about pre-treatment resistance mutations, because some individuals can be infected with viruses that have already have resistant mutations. And this graph shows us that incomplete HIV suppression would give us very limited viral load reduction, and CD4 cells would go down. Pre-existing resistance mutation in the second graph up right would give us very short result, and patient would very soon be resistant for the drug that is applied. And drugs that have a high genetic barrier would give us more time before having chance for resistance mutations. And now, in these years, we also have drugs that have very high resistance barrier to resistance mutations. In this graph, I can show you the study of ours that we found resistance mutations in patients who had this, who harbored these mutations before even starting therapy. And here I can show you that there are mutations to 3 antiretroviral classes, NRTIs, NNRTIs, and protease inhibitors. However, now we have more chance to have better results with the new drugs that would have high chance to prevent evolving of resistance mutations. We have very different classes of inhibitors of the HIV replication, including entry inhibitors, NRTIs, and NNRTIs. We have integral strength transfer inhibitors that are used for several years now, and they have very good pharmacokinetic profile that makes even better for patients, because it's not so important to stick to good adherence. It gives us a few days not to take pills for some patients, and the result is still very good. And there are many others antiretroviral inhibitors that are also in development. This all gives us a good idea that we can manage HIV infection very well. And with this slide, I will finish my presentation. With the Timothy T. Brown, the first patient that was cured from HIV, and HIV was eradicated from this patient. Unfortunately, he died last year, but however, Timothy Ray Brown inspired many of us, patients, researchers in public health, and shows all that there is hope. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Docent Alexiev, for the wonderful talk. It is amazing for me as a relative outsider of the topic of HIV to observe how much has been done in this long history since the discovery of the virus and the current days in the evolution of pharmaceuticals. It would be nice also good to hear how the how life has evolved for persons living with the disease, and for this I would like first to give the floor to our next lady speaker, who is Miss Susan Cole. First, I will introduce her shortly. Susan is an award-winning HIV activist, broadcaster, writer, and public speaker, advocating for people living with HIV for 2 decades. She has worked for a number of NGOs, including the National AIDS Trust and the UK Coalition of People Living with HIV, and has served as a trustee of the Children's HIV Association and the Women's HIV charity, the Sophia Forum. She is particularly passionate about issues affecting women and people from Black communities living with HIV, writing for a number of publications about the health inequalities they face. She has organized numerous broadcasting events and workshops dedicated to community engagement and coping with HIV, and has been recognized as one of the top 10 Black HIV influencers in the UK. Beyond the typical epidemiological endpoints pursued by modern healthcare, Susan will address the quality of life of patients living with HIV, which I believe is a topic often underestimated by our, let's say, more performance-based vision about how to fight the disease. Susan, you are welcome to provide your perspective. I'm happy to have you here today. Please proceed forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me speak today. All of the presentations so far have been absolutely fascinating, and it's wonderful to be with everyone, and I'm particularly looking forward to our next speaker and hearing his perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about issues affecting women living with HIV and quality of life, as you say. This year we marked 40 years since the first cases of AIDS were reported. It's the start of a global pandemic that has rampaged across the world. Over this period, 34 million people have died from AIDS-related causes, and 77.5 million people have become infected with HIV. Today, 37.6 million people are living with HIV, and I am one of those people. I never imagined that HIV would be an issue that would affect me. When I was at university, there was the whole campaign in the UK, Don't Die of Ignorance, with big icebergs and tombstones, and at the time I very much thought that HIV was just an issue that affects gay men. However, I was diagnosed through a routine immigration test in the USA in the late 90s, and it just didn't cross my mind for a moment that it could come back as positive. The doctor actually said to me, well, the good news is you don't have syphilis, but the bad news is you're HIV positive, and oh, you have about 7 years to live. So seeing that this was over 20 years ago, fortunately, he was very wrong. But my way of coping with that was to find out everything that I could about HIV. And it was actually through NAM AIDS Map, the HIV information charity that I work for today, that I found out that the doctor was very wrong. And in reality, things have moved on a great deal in that people living with HIV can expect to live as long as anyone else. If we're on effective treatment, it's impossible to pass the virus on to our sexual partners. And also, women on treatment can have children born free of HIV, which is, it's just tremendous. And since my diagnosis, I've had 2 fabulous children, both born free of HIV because I had access to treatment. But around the world, the situation can be very different. There are still 25% of people living with HIV around the world who don't have access to treatment, and women continue to be disproportionately affected by HIV. In sub-Saharan Africa, 4,500 young women are infected with HIV every week, and young women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with HIV than young men. And women face intersecting forms of stigma, criminalization, and gender-based violence. Women with HIV are significantly more likely to experience gender-based violence than other women, and very often that is fueled by stigma and self-stigma. I know of a number of women who are staying in relationships with abusive partners because their partner says to them things like, well, because you're HIV positive, no one else is going to want you, so you have to stay with me. So the situation can be terrible. Also, women are sometimes blackmailed in terms of their HIV status. So it's a really nasty and unpleasant situation. And also, women who are victims of domestic violence are also more likely to acquire HIV. So it's very bad, and things have got much worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. Gender-based violence has spiked up to 500%. In some countries. But despite being disproportionately affected by HIV, women continue to be significantly underrepresented in clinical trials. And because of that, information about potential side effects and potential harmful side effects aren't getting to us. I mean, I think recently, this has been the case about weight gain in relation to some classes of drugs. I know women were speaking to me showing it's that much of a problem, but fortunately there was a clinical trial recently that shown that women were significantly more impacted, with 27% of women on one combination becoming obese versus 7% of men. But despite these challenges, it's tremendous that we do have effective treatment, and that when we're on treatment we can't pass it on. But there's so much more to good health than simply having an undetectable viral load and having a CD4 count. Quality of life is an incredibly important factor where it comes to HIV, and is so infrequently missed out of the conversation. A number of factors can impact on quality of life for people with HIV. These include things like multimorbidity, poverty, social isolation, difficulty disclosing status, and persecution due to discriminatory laws and attitudes. people with HIV report a number of components to health-related quality of life that are important to us, such as the physical, such as things like pain and gastro problems, cognitive factors such as memory and sleep, psychological issues, social issues such as isolation and intimacy, functional issues including the independence and the ability to perform everyday activities, welfare such as things like finances and immigration, spiritual well-being, and information, which I think is absolutely crucial for good quality of life. It was because of the information that I had from NAM and other sources that I've been able to make decisions about my treatment and care. But for so many people, there are significant barriers to accurate information. And I think COVID has shone a light on some of these inequalities in terms of people accessing quality information, and very often the stigma and discrimination that people are facing is actually in healthcare settings. And that can have a huge impact on people in terms of trusting healthcare professionals, talking about the situations that they're experiencing. And often healthcare professionals aren't asking us the questions about quality of life. And I think it's incredibly important to recognize that in terms of HIV, we are all so different and our situations are incredibly different. And so care needs to be person-centered. Despite all of these challenges, I do want to emphasize that as people living with HIV, we are not passive, voiceless victims. It's incredibly important that we are at the heart of every decision made about our care at all aspects of research, development, and planning. And as I said, it's incredibly important that care is person-centered, and there cannot be decisions about us without us. But crucially, I think it's really important to emphasize that we cannot end AIDS until we end inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for the wonderful talk. I do have a few questions to ask, but maybe a bit later when we come back to discussion. It's quite inspiring to hear your story, and I guess both you and Tamas are not the regular HIV patient. You are famous for your, let's say, HIV status, and maybe a life for people such as you is different than a life for a person that probably selected few people know about their status. And this is something that maybe we can discuss later a little bit. But first, I want to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Dr. Thomas Beretsky. Please correct me, Dr. Beretsky, if I'm mispronouncing your name. But in any case, first I will introduce you shortly. Dr. Beretsky currently works as an independent consultant and researcher with Patvocates, a patient-led consulting network in Germany. He also coordinates the patient cluster in the IMI-supported big data project Harmony. HIV positive since 2003, he served as a member of the board of directors of the European AIDS Treatment Group for almost 4 years, and also served as the co-chair of the European Commission's Civil Society Forum on HIV/AIDS between 2013 and 15. And he's been involved in numerous EU and global projects. As a consultant, he focuses on developing training courses and processes for patient engagement, both for patient and advocacy organizations and the pharmaceutical industry. Tamas will now share how patient activism has impacted HIV policies as well as the life of patients. Tamas, welcome. I give you the floor. Please Let's see what you will share with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I find that this is really a tremendously interesting event, and I enjoy massively listening to you, especially from my dear colleague Susan. And I really appreciate this opportunity. I think it's a very relevant question that you just asked, Valentin, about how different our lives are, maybe because we are activists and so to say in the limelight of HIV advocacy and activism. However, I must admit, I don't think that our lives are very different. Maybe our coping strategies are different. So maybe how we have come to deal with our diagnosis and the life with HIV, or what it entails, that is different. But we try to use this, and this is why we have been working. It's a pretty big community, by the way. So the community of HIV advocates and activists. This is why we have been so adamant on speaking up and representing the voices of others who are maybe not in the position like we are. But after all, you know, I also come from Eastern or Central Europe, originally from Hungary, and I think that I had to go through the same stages of grief and stigma and discrimination like any other person living with HIV, and then came out at the other end maybe with different coping strategies, but not necessarily different, a very different life. But let's come back to that and maybe after all the presentations and talks. What I'm going to talk to you about is indeed what patient involvement and patient advocacy means, not just in HIV, but in general. And why I will speak about this in general is because the tradition of patient advocacy and patient activism indeed started with HIV about 30 years ago, roughly, with the involvement and the agency of people living with HIV. And so that's also my research topic. So that's what I've been doing as a social psychologist, or researching as a social psychologist. But it's also my daily life. This is what I've been doing for the last 15 years, together with people like Susan and numerous others. By the way, also some of them in Bulgaria, some really powerful and very well-known activists who live in Bulgaria and have been working from there. These are my disclosures. I don't receive any funding for my research, and I would like to kick off with a fundamental question, which is, whose illness is it? And this may seem like a philosophical question, or even funny to ask in this context, but you will very often hear from doctors and also researchers when they say that I have a patient with HIV, right? Or my HIV patients, or when researchers generate data and when they work in their labs, then it's their data, it's their results, it's their papers. But in fact, it's ultimately a virus that lives in my body, right? So it's part of my body, it's part of my life, it's part of my tissues. So I think that one very important basic tenet of patient advocacy is this process of reclaiming the illness that you live with. And this applies to HIV, but it also applies to other diseases. It's not the doctor's, it's not the researcher's illness, it's my illness. And so I have every right and interest to understand what's going on in my body and what's happening to my life. And so I want to have control over it. And that's I think, the fundamental principle for patient engagement and for patient activism, which tries to regain this kind of control that should not lay with society exclusively, and it should not lay with the medical establishment exclusively, but it should be a combination of all stakeholders that control the illness and that control the lives of people living with an illness. So patient involvement, when we speak about patient involvement, there's this very basic framework that we use, which was described by Sherry Ornstein back in...
Sorry, could you switch to full screen so that we can see a little bit better?
Sure. Hold on,
Sorry
I thought it was already. That's okay. Is it better now?
Yes, much better. Thank you very much.
All right. So, so Sherry Ornstein described this, if you like, hierarchy or paradigm of citizen involvement, of citizen control. So she wasn't specific about patients, but she was specific about civil society and civil control and participation. But this is basically the paradigm that we've all been using also in patient engagement, where we say that actually therapy and manipulation, so talking to patients and telling them what to do, is not really involvement, right? So that doesn't count as involvement because it's not a two-way process. And when you talk about informing patients or consulting patients or using patients in your research work or in your policy work for testimonials or as people who are showcased as case studies for a given illness, which is called application, that's also not real involvement. Real involvement, real co-creation and working together means partnership, it means the delegation of responsibilities, and it means control by the people who are affected. So in this case, Ornstein calls this citizen control. We call it patient control because we come obviously from patient engagement. So why do we do this? We do this because we know that pharmaceutical companies, researchers, patients, but also the state, also the medical establishment are in the same boat. We have the same aims, and they just represent the two sides of the same coin. And it just makes more sense to collaborate, because if we work together, that will reduce research waste. It will also reduce the amount of pointless and maybe tokenistic policy decisions. So that also improves the processes, streamlines research and policy, scientific and policy processes. At the same time, there have been tremendous efforts by the patient communities, not just in HIV. Yes, it started in HIV, but since then we've seen this develop in many other disease areas, in particular in a lot of cancers, in solid and liquid tissue cancers. So there have been tremendous efforts on the patient side to become real partners. Complex, elaborate training processes, training courses for patient advocates and for patient experts, countless conferences, websites, all sorts of forums for cooperation have been emerging over the last 20 years in order to facilitate the inclusion of patients from the patient side. So we know that if you want to have better medicine, then that can only happen through collaboration and talking to each other and co-creation, which is also the bottom line of this process. So there are different types of patients, and I will not go into a lot of detail. When we talk about patients, we talk about individual patients, but we also include carers, caregivers. We talk about patient representatives who may or may not live with a given illness, but we also talk about patient advocates who live with a given illness, but also speak on behalf of other patients. And we speak about patient experts, and I will come back to that a little bit. And for example, Susan or myself would qualify as patient experts. So people who not only understand the illness itself, but also understand the social determinants, the entire environment, how the given illness and people living with or affected by an illness are embedded in society, how they interact with other stakeholders. So that's a broader range of knowledge, which is not just biological knowledge, but it's also social, societal knowledge and preparedness. why do we do this whole thing? So what's the point in patient advocacy? And there are certain different or distinct areas where patient advocates excel. And again, this is something that comes from the HIV tradition. So yes, we provide support to fellow patients, and we signpost them to services, and we provide peer help, very literal help, like escorting people to the doctor if they are too afraid to go, or going out to communities and providing testing, for example. We also provide help, so not just like theoretical support, but also very practical help. We also influence, patient advocates try to influence policy decisions, scientific decisions, also decisions within the patient community. We tell about our stories, and you could listen to Susan to show that there are examples for different coping strategies. And we also educate. We educate fellow patients. We also educate healthcare providers or healthcare professionals, nurses, doctors, in order to explain and to show to them what is the power of patient communities, what is it that they can do, and how they can contribute to healthcare systems in general. So this is what patient advocates, what patient organizations do. They provide patient support, which is information, support, navigation, educational functions, but also patient organizations work in health policy, influencing it, also influencing patient care pathways, and they also participate in research by contributing to partnerships, and also providing co-creation functions in these partnerships. So patient organizations have become well-developed, strong organizations, again, not just in HIV. Yes, we have many of them in HIV, but that's no longer exclusive, fortunately. But you will find a lot of peer support groups, also lobby groups that will work with politicians, even on a pan-European level. Several patient organizations sit in Brussels and do this type of policy, this lobbying work. There are health leagues which combine patient organizations and umbrellas from several disease areas. And then there are national umbrellas and regional umbrellas. And all of them can have a mixture of objectives and work streams and projects that they do. And also they work very often together with human rights organizations, right? Which is a very logical step if we say that according to our current human rights paradigm, the right to health is a fundamental human right. So that means that if we want to work in health, we also have to work together with human rights advocates, because and if we want to follow the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, then that again adds to this dimension that it is must happen in combination with human rights advocacy. So the time when patient organizations were just cute little informal groups sitting together or meeting every Saturday over tea and discussing their issues and problems, those times are over. These patient organizations are massive, large, influential groups with millions of euros in their budgets, working together on the level of policy and in the domains of policy and science, with all different stakeholders, sometimes with up to 100 employees, different offices. So the world has changed tremendously, and in terms of patient advocacy. And here, this change was indeed spearheaded by the HIV community, and it started, as I said, about 30 years ago, because the HIV community could actually achieve, through a very intensive advocacy work, some fundamental changes in how healthcare is done and provided, and in how research is done. For example, through the introduction of the accelerated approval process at the EMA and also at the FDA in the United States. This accelerated approval process was, for example, used now for the COVID vaccines. So these are living traditions, and the first instance of the accelerated approval procedure was for HIV drugs back in the 80s, when it became obvious that waiting 10 years for the approval of a drug is simply too long, because too many people would die during these 10 years. And there was a number of similar policy initiatives on the level of medicine's approval, which was initiated and claimed by the HIV community, and then is here to stay, and that has been used by the healthcare establishment and the regulatory authorities ever since. So patients and patient organizations today have their credibility because they have the lived experience, and you could hear this powerful testimonial from Susan. They can report credibly about this lived experience. Patients will have different priorities from clinicians or researchers. So while a clinician may perhaps value increased survival, which is particularly relevant in cancer, for example, at the same time, patients may perhaps prefer a shorter life expectancy, but good quality of life. Again, you remember what Susan said about the importance of quality of life. So maybe I don't want to live another 30 years bedridden, but I just want to have another 10 years, but those 10 years should be good quality of life. So patients will have different priorities, and there's good research about that. And ultimately, the patient is the user of the medicine. So why not allow the patient to decide about how that medicine is administered, what the side effects are, whether these side effects are relevant or irrelevant for the patient itself. So it is essential in this case that patients have a say in how research and also how the actual use of the medicine happens. At the same time, we see an emergence of new technologies and social media, which means that patients actually talk to each other, so they are no longer isolated or so much dependent on their doctors. Patients no longer care about these hierarchical structures of the medical establishment or of healthcare. Also, there's a continuous monitoring of pharmaceutical companies about adverse events discussed by patients. So this is a source of information that needs to be reckoned with. There are tweet chats and conference reports, and there's a lot of gossip and advice. So there's a very lively conversation going on in patient communities, which is again across disease areas and not limited to just one like HIV, but it also branches out and intersects with different patient communities. We see the emergence of big data, and patients do have an opinion about who owns these data, and they want to retain and they want to have ownership of their own data. It's my body, my tissue, my blood. I want to know what's happening to the data that I provide. And this is also then further complicated by the emergence of Google and Amazon and Apple and other large data collectors and data managers, which relies on wearables, phone apps, smartwatches. So it's become very, very complex and complicated, but patients understand this. Now, what we see is that there is this divide within patient communities as well, because these two images live side by side, live in parallel. So yes, there's this image of the patient, of the frail old person who struggles with an illness, but at the same time, you also have these powerful communities, like at the one of the recent AIDS conferences in 2018, where 6,000 of the 18,000 delegates were people living with HIV. And they were there at the conference speaking up for their interests, expressing their views, influencing processes. So there is this new schism, there's this new divide in terms of health literacy and digital literacy and digital health literacy, which poses a new challenge to patient communities as well. But these interconnected and educated communities will resist patronizing and hierarchical healthcare. So there's a seed for change there. We talk a lot about the access to data and the ownership of data, as I have mentioned already. And also we realize that this knowledge and solidarity that is there in patient communities escapes the traditional business logic. So patient organizations don't operate like businesses. They don't make a profit, and they don't want to make a profit. What they want is that patients live better lives. And so we also need a different logic if we look at patient organizations and if we try to work with them. And this again comes from the civil society tradition of HIV related or connected to the civil liberties movements of gay people, lesbians, and last but not least, of Black folks in the US and in the UK. So this strong push, this strong claim for equality, for equal rights also in health, is what has been a living tradition in patient advocacy ever since. So this also leads to new relationships emerging within healthcare and from patient communities. And again, what is particularly important here is the active fight against anti-science movements and working with patients as vigilantes who try to work against this the anti-science movement, right? So we know that science works. We know because science keeps us alive. So we believe in science. Therefore, we will also try to do everything we can in order to counter anti-science movements. And if you look at social media, or if you look at publications that are coming out now during the COVID crisis, you will see how much of that work has been done by patient communities from infectious diseases, not just HIV again, but other infectious diseases as well, but also from non-communicable diseases. So that's been, again, something where these threads, these different areas converge and come together. So we see the emergence of the expert patient. The expert patient is, as I said, a person who's particularly knowledgeable about the illness, but also about everything else that surrounds the illness. Again, something that comes from the HIV tradition. Was first described by Stephen Epstein in the early 90s, who looked at what happened in the HIV world and then found this common pattern. And this common pattern has been pursued by patient activists and advocates ever since. And you know why this is important? This is important because this ultimately leads to a different model of citizenship as well. People who are patients and so are on the bottom of the hierarchy in healthcare, when they train themselves to become expert patients, they also become more conscious consumers and more empowered citizens, right? So this is a very straightforward process of empowerment, of democracy building, and of a different model of citizenship, which also, because of the empowerment perspective, also helps combat stigma through education, through the spreading of information, through the demonstration of positive coping strategies and participation. So if we say that it all starts with the patient, then it also means, right, so biomedical research starts from the patient need, or so we say, then there's a logical step to say that, well, in that case, patients should be involved throughout the entire spectrum of biomedical research and development. And so patients got together and also have developed within the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, or EUPATI, they have developed this roadmap for patient engagement, and I will not walk you through this whole thing, but you will see that there are plenty of areas from the earliest research to the latest stages when the drug is already on the market and is being used and deployed in patients and in different illnesses. So there are a number of different areas and concrete tasks where patients can make an impact and can make an input into the processes. And that's what has been becoming the leading paradigm in biomedical research and development, and also in policy processes, because a lot of this later stage is already policy. So this is very, very simple. Science and policy work go hand in hand. If you could learn it, then I can learn it too. You didn't become a doctor because God appointed you to be a doctor, but you became a doctor because you studied. And so if this is information, this is just knowledge. And if you could learn it, I can learn it too. And because I know what I want, I also want to know how I can achieve that. And that's exactly what I will do as a patient advocate in order to speak the same language with you all, and in order to create an environment of understanding where we can work for our common objective. And the common objective is that people live longer, they stay alive, and they live good lives. And we do this through evidence-based advocacy. So yes, we have testimonials. Yes, we can talk a lot about how we live with HIV and what is our quality of life and how we got here and all of that. But we also have the data. And again, you remember Susan quoting all the different data and information like hard data, numbers about what's going on in HIV right now. And we use these data and we underpin our claims and complaints and perspectives with hard evidence. And that's what's called evidence-based advocacy. And again, this is, I think, the most important legacy of the early years or early days of HIV activism, because that was how it started. In the US in the 80s, people did their own research, and not just in quotation marks, not just by reading up stuff on the internet or watching YouTube videos, it didn't even exist at the time, but actually doing research, doing the work that doctors at the time, for whatever reason, and epidemiologists at the time didn't do or didn't want to do. Nobody wanted to work with the gay community at the time because it wasn't chic, right? It wasn't politically right to do that. So they did it for themselves. And they produced this evidence and published this evidence. And that tradition has been guiding us ever since. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamas. I really enjoy how you stressed a lot on the information, knowledge, and the evidence-based approach. And I'm curious what you think regarding how many patients are actually, so to say, willing to work with evidence, to read a lot, and to be actively participating and in control. Because I think we see a lot during the COVID pandemic that certain people act as if they are not willing to know, that they're not willing to get to the bottom of things and apply this purely, let's say, scientific approach of taking informed decisions about their own life and the life of the community. What do you think about this?
I think that we have to take, we have to treat the COVID situation a little differently at this point. And the reason is because there's no clear definition of who the patients are. In case of the vaccines, and I think that this is something that will come up again and again. In case of the vaccines, the target population is everyone. It's the people, right? So ideally, everyone should be vaccinated. So it's very difficult to say or to delineate a patient community in this case. But if you look at what happens in long COVID, right, which is a more or less well-defined a group of symptoms now, and it's turning into a real illness by definition as well. If you look at what happens there is a community already. It's emerging now, but there are some really strong advocates there. Just to mention one of our dear colleagues, Darren Brown in the UK, who have been doing a lot of work to build a community along the same principles like other patient communities. But you cannot do that when the community is the whole world. I mean, were we able to do that, we wouldn't have wars, right? So that would be the ultimate solution and world peace. But that's not feasible at this point. So as soon as there is a possibility to define a community, then this also works. Then these strategies work, and they also emerge. And this can work on different levels. So this works on the level of town. This can work on the level of a village. This can work even on the level of school. So when people get together in a school in the US, or even and we've seen examples for that in Hungary, for example. So when a school gets together and they say that, no, we want everyone to be vaccinated, and then they do their job there, that's the community. And they go out and convince everyone, every single parent and every single student to get vaccinated. That's again evidence-based advocacy for a community. And then in this case, the community is maybe just that school, but it is a well-defined community. And you cannot do this without having people that you want to talk to, because you will not be able to talk to the whole world.
Thank you very much for this opinion, and we'll hear some more about the interactions with the community from our next speaker, who is Mr. Momchil Baev. I will make first a short introduction, but before that I want to let Momchil know that we have some time, so even though the initial plan is to finish at 3 o'clock sharp, please take your time in Chile, and we will hear everything, and I think there will be even time for some short discussion afterwards. So before I give the floor to Momchil, I want to introduce him briefly. He has more than 10 years of experience in the field of healthcare on various issues, including sexual health and HIV. He holds a PhD in social medicine and a master's in public health management from the Medical University of Sofia. He has been devoted to research, patient access, and quality of care. Currently, he is leading the Sexual Health and HIV program of the Single Step Foundation, introducing innovative approaches to improve access to services and care for most at-risk populations. Momchil will talk about HIV self-testing as a tool for HIV screening amongst groups at risk, and also I welcome Momchil to focus not only on the achievements, but to stress maybe on some of the issues that are still open and we need to work on. Momchil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Valentin. Thank you for having me in this panel of this very much needed event. Good day to all the audience watching us online. And let me share my screen with you. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, perfectly.
Good. So, as you mentioned, I will be speaking about HIV self-testing as a method of prevention, but also as an innovation. Although it's been well known in the Americas and the rest of Europe, around here, it's still seen as a little exotic. So In 2016, WHO recommended HIV self-testing as a safe, accurate, and effective way to reach people who may not test otherwise. And I stress on this, for people who may not test otherwise. Globally, many countries have developed HIV self-testing policies, which include effective service delivery models, linkage to care, and support tools. As of HIV testing availability, there are locally manufactured HIV self-tests with national level approvals in several countries. For example, 4 local manufactured HIV self-tests are approved in Brazil, 1 in Nigeria, and 1 in Belarus. However, there is a vast amount of other tests that are internationally recognized and pre-qualified by WHO. Like I mentioned, WHO strongly supports HIV self-testing and has issued recommendations and guidelines how to introduce it on national level. The table on the following slide presents the HIV self-test kits, which are pre-qualified by WHO as well as the status of HIV self-testing in national policies and the following slide. Obviously, we don't need to read the whole table. I know it's a busy slide, but just to give you an example of how many certified self-tests are available around the world in Europe, and they all have CE mark, which makes them available for the European markets. I have personal experience with the ORQUIC HIV self-tests with the communities in Bulgaria, and I will be speaking a little more about it in the following slide. This map of the world presented by WHO shows the countries which have some sort of a national policy or guidelines on HIV self-testing. Don't get confused that the whole world has self-testing in place. Keep in mind that Russia does not have the self-testing policy implemented, but it does have different programs. As an example, the fast-track cities and countries where they target specific communities. So this is the case with Russia and some other EU, Eastern European countries. As you can see on the map, Bulgaria is in the red color, which means Bulgaria is one of few countries in the world that still does not have any policy on HIV self-testing, unfortunately. Following the logic and of what previous speakers mentioned, I apologize, the slide is in Bulgarian, but it's very straightforward. I just added it because I was inspired from what Susan mentioned of how women are disproportionately affected by HIV. Well, the case in Bulgaria is very much different, and I would say the case in Europe as well. HIV epidemic here is heavily concentrated in the MSM community. This graph shows the gender distribution of new HIV infections in Bulgaria between 2010 and 2020, data coming from the Ministry of Health and the National HIV Program. So you see men tend to be 80 and above 80, up to 84% in 2020 of all new HIV cases, where women...
Sorry to interrupt you, only to mention that for English-speaking attendees, the blue bars represent the men and the red bars represent the women.
Yes, thank you, Valentin. Yes, thank you. I thought I mentioned it. Yes, the blue bar is the men and red is women. So you see the disproportionate affection of men compared to women, and majority of those men are, of course, men who have sex with other men. I would like to take a look at a few case studies, examples from the rest of Eastern Europe, because countries like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus are heavily hit by the HIV epidemic, but they also lack the political will to solve the pandemic. And this is why I want to put the Bulgarian case in the context of Eastern Europe and present you a couple of examples from other countries. In the context of stigma and discrimination experienced by men who have sex with men and transgender people in Russia, providing convenient, discreet, and anonymous testing and referral options is important. There's this Safe Box project in Russia supported by Elton John AIDS Foundation, which began in 2017 in 5 large cities, including the capital Moscow and St. Petersburg. It gives the MSM and transgender people access to free HIV self-test kits at community organizations, clinics, private pharmacies, etc. And this real-world implementation of HIV self-testing in 2017, over 10,000 self-tests were conducted in the country. Of the 28 self-testers who self-reported their results, 15% had reactive results, meaning positive, suggesting that this program reached to higher risk population, which also leads me to the assumption that community approaches are a lot more targeted at the communities at risk than general activities carried by governments and ministries of health. Let's take a quick look at Ukraine. In 2015, the Alliance for Public Health initiated a new outreach-based HIV testing approach called Assisted HIV Self-Testing. Prior to 2015, HIV testing access was limited by the availability of medical staff. In most cases, staff were available only a few hours of the day, and that's why, to alleviate the issue, assisted self-testing was introduced in Ukraine, again, by a patient organization. Since the introduction of this approach, access to HIV testing has increased from 40 to 120%, suggesting that biotech advances can be a game changer. And if we bring the advances of biotechnology, give it to the communities and patient advocates and community groups who reach out to the communities at risk, will have a greater impact than the government would have on their own. Belarus. Pharmacists in all regions of Belarus are currently selling self-tests at a very affordable price. The rollout of self-testing was accompanied by a large-scale campaign to raise awareness about HIV and to encourage people to get tested. These campaigns included outdoor advertising at large-scale events with high visibility. As of April 2018, pharmacists had sold over 2,500 HIV self-tests. Of those, 20 individuals showed up for further testing to confirm their status. Of these, 18 came positive. Now, let's narrow it down to the local context in Bulgaria. As I am advocating for policy changes on local level, I would like to give you this context as well. Barely any innovation in prevention exists currently in the national policy on HIV control and prevention. Non-existent national policy on HIV self-testing whatsoever, although good examples on community level exist, which I will present in a few minutes. HIV self-testing has been seen as an exotic and unreliable method. HIV prevention is underfunded, as it is in many other countries in Eastern Europe. HIV testing is almost entirely institutionalized, which poses barriers to communities at risk and in rural areas. Stigma prevents people from seeking HIV testing in clinical settings. This is why we need to modernize and liberalize, if you wish, the methods for prevention focused on HIV testing. It cannot be only located within public health institutions as it is now, and the people need to have this testing closer to them without having to directly interact with institutions. HIV testing in Bulgaria is regulated in an ordinance of the Minister of Health from 2009, allowing only medical personnel in clinical settings to perform HIV testing. This couldn't be more outdated than it is. The rest of the continent, the rest of the world has already years ago implemented self-testing, and it's seen as reliable and a good method of having a person to perform a test at home without having to go to a clinical setting. Anonymous HIV testing in Bulgaria is only available in 14 government-operated testing centers located in district cities. Only 2 community centers offer HIV and STI testing in the country, and this is based in the capital. So you see we have still a large part of the country that's not covered by any services for anonymous or confidential HIV testing. The majority of the community of MSM and trans people would rather not visit a public health institution due to stigma, as other speakers mentioned before me. An impediment for many members of the target group is the fact that the centers are located in a state institution where an ID card and the purpose of a visit are required for entry. Although the testing itself is anonymous, people would need to go through a checkpoint, be questioned where they go and why they visit the institution, which already makes the HIV testing not very accessible and not really anonymous and confidential. So HIV self-testing is the solution to break the barrier before the community is at risk and those who would not visit public health facilities for testing. I will give you a short overview of an initiative that we carried out in Bulgaria with Single Step Foundation, where we first piloted in 2018 the HIV self-testing initiative for men who have sex with men and trans people. That campaign was accompanied by a survey screening testing habits and attitudes of the community. HIV self-testing were marketed entirely online through digital channels. We partnered up with Grindr, which turned out, as expected, to be the most focused channel to reach to the MSM community, and a small part of them were the trans people. We also advertised on Facebook and Instagram, but the majority of users received that information through Grindr. This is, as we know, a dating app for gay and MSM, trans people, bisexual, and it's well known and used in the community. So users would receive a screen notification on their screen prompting them to order the HIV self-test. Then they would go to the website of Single Step, where they fill out a short questionnaire, which I mentioned about for the survey, and then they put in their address where they want the test to be shipped. The test was free of charge, is free of charge, and the users only had to pay for the shipping costs, which is anywhere around 2-3 euro per test. We've, of course, established a dedicated support phone line with access to the sexual health manager, myself, in case of any concerns, questions, or in case of a positive result. So users had the possibility to reach out if they got a positive result. This is usually a shock for many people, and the first phase of finding out is usually acute, and it comes with a lot of anxiety, panic, fear, shame. So the opportunity for people to reach out to someone who would support them in that process is very important. So we close the cycle of awareness, testing, psychological support, linkage to care, and then further support for treatment adherence. So this is a short graph explaining where we got all the users. You see 67% of users found out about self-testing on Grindr, 21% in Facebook, and 11% from Instagram. We had 1,574 people who filled out the survey, and then 900 of them ordered the test that was shipped to their home. We invited participants to fill out another questionnaire after they performed the test. Only 332 decided to do so and report their result. We had about, of the 900 tests, we had 12 positive results who were then confirmed, linked to care, and have received ongoing support for adhering to their treatment. This is an excerpt from the survey we performed with the HIV self-testing initiative. As you can see, we've asked people whether they use condom when they have sex, and On the left-hand side, you see a large group of people who don't always use condom. If we combine known, rarely, and often together, that makes an overwhelming majority of people who are not, or who are at least exposed to some level of risk for HIV infection. Looking at the time of the last test for HIV, we also have some concerning results that show that many people don't test regularly, people who are sexually active, who have multiple partners, some of them, a large part of them, would test once a year or more rarely. You see 26, almost 27% tested for the last time more than a year ago, which shows us that how inaccessible HIV testing is, how many barriers there are to it. And in rural areas, there are no options at all. A person would need to travel to a district city and get tested there. So obviously we asked our users which methods of the HIV test would they prefer. Just as expected, the majority prefer HIV-free home tests. Getting closer to my closing remarks, I'd like to stress that the biotech advancements and achievements allow for quicker and accessible solutions. Broad HIV screening is the road to ending the HIV pandemic, and only user-friendly and accessible solutions to all can achieve that. Using home-based self-testing kits is the most effective way for screening of the hard-to-reach MSM and trans populations, especially true in countries in Eastern Europe where stigma is higher than the countries in Western Europe or the Americas. We make it possible for advanced healthcare technologies from concept to practice to be brought to people who need them, if I may use the slogan of this event. I'd like to express my gratitude to Bianca Tufulu, medical student at the Medical University of Sofia, and the many other volunteers who support the work of Single Step Foundation, the peer supporters who work with the people living with HIV, and everyone who's contributing to our work. You can't see HIV, but you can talk about it. And my message to the audience and to the other panelists and stakeholders who are watching us now: bring biotechnology innovation closer to people so we can end the HIV epidemic. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy if we have chance for a little discussion.
Momchil, thank you very much for your participation and the wonderful talk. And I'm glad that you shared your experience and also some other countries' experience with this tool that you named it so aptly. But what I see is that a tool is only active when we grab inside the toolbox and use it. And also it makes a big impression from the statistics that you show that a very small percentage of the patients who actually took the home tests reported back their results. And I would urge the panelists to discuss this issue. And I guess this is not only an issue regarding the self-test for HIV, but also for other interactions. How do you think this could improve in order to more or less to get to more people who actually do not know they are having the HIV?
Well, my answer to this would be that it's very important to reach out to the broader MSM or LGBT community, if you like. However, HIV in Bulgaria is concentrated in the MSM community, so I'd rather speak about that community. And if we find the right channels to reach out to the entire community in a country, then we give them an opportunity to think about it, to question themselves, to consider their sexual practices, to consider potential risks, and most of all, to know they have the opportunity to do a screening HIV test. Not only that, but to have the opportunity to do it at home, to have the opportunity to do it anonymously, confidentially, without going to a clinic, without seeing a doctor, a nurse, or anyone who might know them at a public health clinic. So we are trying to bring down the barriers that are preventing people from testing for HIV. And this is the home testing. It's so easy to perform, especially with the oral swab. It's no intervention required, no blood. Even the blood tests with a finger prick, I think, are a good method for home testing. However, the oral swab tend to be a little more easier and straightforward, and this provides a very, very good opportunity for our communities, at least from what I see. And just to mention, the initiative I presented days back in November 2018. Then we launched again self-testing campaign in 2020 because of COVID-19. When COVID started, the 14 HIV testing centers in the country operated by the Ministry of Health were closed down because the human resources working there had to be brought in the fight against COVID-19. So at some point between March 2020 and until sometime in 2021, HIV testing was not available at all in the country, besides private laboratories where you pay and you, of course, register with your name and ID card. So we decided to fill that gap. We managed to provide the self-testing kits, and we've been supplying them to our community since August 2020 again. And the campaign is still ongoing, but this campaign will end most likely by the end of this year, which means starting next year, self-testing will be not available again. This is why we as a community group and myself are advocating to the Ministry of Health to finally regulate and introduce self-testing as a reliable and accessible method of prevention.
Okay, thank you, Momchil. I invite the other speakers for some closing remarks or comments. Please feel free to comment any of the talks and maybe discuss a topic that you believe is not put on the table. Personally, I think that I was a little overwhelmed by the picture that Momchil has presented about the distribution of diagnosed patients among male and female. And I would like to ask Susan if she believes that there is data that there is a big proportion of undiagnosed women out there, and how do you think, Susan, we could improve this?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It's something that we're seeing in the UK, particularly with older women who frequently, I think healthcare providers don't regard at being at risk of HIV. So I think there needs to be much more in terms of national campaigns about HIV, that it isn't that it can happen to anybody. I mean, for me personally, before my diagnosis, I had actually requested an HIV test from my GP, who said to me, "Oh no, dear, no, that's nothing that actually affects women like you." So yeah, that's quite shocking in terms of issues that we face. So I think, you know, there definitely needs to be a lot more of information. And I think testing, home testing is fantastic, but we need to get that information out, that it reaches everyone about the reality of testing today, and for people to know that why testing is so important, that if they test, they can start life-saving treatment, and that HIV isn't a barrier to living a full and fulfilling life.
skepticism for your answer. Dr. Alexiev, Docent Alexiev, I wanted to ask, sorry to jump back a little bit, but regarding the genotyping of resistance, actually, at what point is this performed? Is it performed immediately after a patient is newly diagnosed with as an HIV carrier, or only after therapy is initiated and there is, let's say, phenotypic evidence that the therapy is not working well?
Thank you. So far, it was very interesting for me, the presentations before and after me. So I really like that I joined this meeting. Regarding your question, there are two purposes for testing for resistance. One idea is to find if the individual infected with HIV have been already infected with the resistant strain. And the idea is to test as soon as possible after the diagnosis, because some of the mutations can disappear in time, and those are making those viruses more. Because of the nature of this virus, let's say all the different strains that coexist in the body can be archived. So in time, all these different strains are archived in the individuals. But because of the nature of resistance, those resistant viruses are not as fit as the wild type virus. So after a person is infected with resistant strain, after some time, a few years later, they may not be easy to find in this patient. However, the archived strains are kept in the cells of these people. So the idea is to test for the transmitted drug resistance as soon as possible after the diagnosis. And the other purpose is to monitor viral load during the therapy, and if the viral load goes up, this could indicate that there is resistance. So there are two ways of resistance testing: the transmitted resistance that we monitor as soon as the patient is diagnosed, and later on, if there are failures in therapy.
Okay, thank you for this clarification. Good. Now I want to give the word to Tamas, who I think raised a hand to say something, and after that I ask Professor Argirova for quick closing remarks, and we move forward with the other program. Tamas.
I'll be short. Responding to what Momchil said about the differences in affected populations, I think it's important to see that this has been repeated by the ECDC, the WHO, UNAIDS for years, that there is not one single epidemic of HIV in Europe or around the world, but there are marked differences in populations and in how how different groups are affected and how treatment is available. So we have to make a difference between what is happening in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Western Europe, and these three patterns are very distinct and quite different. So this means that we also have to take different approaches in these different regions, because the same solutions will not work. What works in the UK or France or here in Germany will not work in Bulgaria or even Hungary, because these are very different trajectories of the epidemic.
I really agree with this point of view, and we are happy to hear your final remarks, and then I give the floor to our first keynote speaker, Petr Delchev. Professor Argirova, you can speak.
Okay, thank you, Valentin, very much. Now I'm absolutely agree with the idea to organize this Bio Atelier with people not only engaged into the science and research, but also being activists in this HIV movement, which is very strong and which showed a good example for a lot of other diseases, as we have seen by Tamas. Thank you, Tamas, for this. This was a very useful topic here. I would like to say some words about the different approaches to different patterns of epidemic, and to give you some examples which will prove this. For example, in Bulgaria, as Ivaylo said, we have 3 or 4, at least 3 different epidemics, kind of virus transmission, and we have a good success into the inhibition and even, well, I could say inhibition of the epidemics into the group of intravenous drug users. For example, in 2008-9, we had more than 30% of the newly infected HIV persons infected by intravenous using. And today, this percent is something 3.5 times lower. So this is a good example of how we could inhibit and really act into this group. But it's not the same into the group of the men who have sex with men, because they are well encapsulated, and we don't have a good and real access to them, to most of them. So another different approach is necessary for this group of people here in our country. About the self-testing, as a person engaged so many years into the HIV field, I know that about 10 years ago, even not only 10, 15, for 10, 12 years ago, about 2007-8, we thought, even in the Ministry of Health, to introduce the self-testing. And what was my well, I was very astonished by the arguments which came against this. There were some articles and some opinions also in international conferences on AIDS, saying that there are samples of and examples of people who have committed suicide after having this self-test being positive. And when the people in the ministry heard about that, of course, they were frightened and decided that maybe it's not the time to introduce this kind of testing. Yes, but this was 12 or 13 years ago, and now I think it's time this question to be risen again, and Momchil has right to this. And I think this question has been risen to the people who are working just now into the introduction of the new AIDS program, HIV/AIDS and STI fight program. At last, I would like to say that maybe if somebody from, well, out of us listened to us, maybe he or she would find that we are quite different in our perceptions, in our thinking, in our saying. But I would say there are no differences between us. We are saying the same things, but in different way, and we are saying and confirming our dedication to our patients, friends, beloved peoples who are suffering HIV. And now we have to go always together to overcome the obstacles of this stigma and discriminations, which are so long remaining in our societies. So thank you for these excellent reports and excellent examples of this fight against stigma and discrimination.
Truly want to thank the other panelists for their participation, and also I would like to mention that we will make sure to electronically introduce everyone to each other if it hasn't been so far, so that further networking, exchange of ideas, advice and good practices can continue, and maybe some of our success stories could help each other in some small way. Even if there is a small particle of positive change from this event, I would be the most happiest person. So thank you to everybody. Now we